afternoon to those of you on the east coast of Australia. Good morning to everybody out in Western Australia, and good evening if you're in the United States. I'm Simon Jackman, the Chief Executive Officer of the United States Study Centre at the University of Sydney, Professor of Political Science here at the university as well. Welcome to another United States Studies webinar, our first, is it post-election? It's not really post-election, I suppose, but our first webinar after election day and the wild, well, a couple of days it's been since. This is part of our regular monthly co-hosted series of webinars with our great friends and colleagues from the Perth USAsia Centre, and I'm joined by their CEO, Gordon Flake, who I'll introduce in just a moment. But as is customary for all our events, I begin by acknowledging that the United States Study Centre and the University of Sydney stands on the traditional lands of the Gadigal people, part of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. In addition to Jeff from Western Australia, today we're thrilled to be joined by two great friends of the United States Study Centre who are based in the United States. Chelsey Martin is on the board of directors of the United States Study Centre, more than just a good friend of the US Study Centre, but she is also partner and managing director of the business advisory firm Bondi Partners. And Chelsey, of course, before this role, had over 2 decades working in the US-Australia bilateral relationship, spanning everything from international diplomacy, trade, investment, and media and strategic communications, perhaps most prominently as Australia's Consul-General, in LA, where big events like G'day LA and then later G'day USA were firmly in her remit, but a very busy landing part of the Australia-US relationship ran through LA, and anybody who's been certainly around the government-to-government relationship or business-to-business relationship knows about Chelsey and her great service to Australia through her stewardship of that part of the US-Australia relationship. So delighted that Chelsey, after government, continues that role, though now in a much more sort of commercial frame. Fantastic. And Jeff Bleich is with us as well. Jeff is affiliated with the Centre as an honorary research associate, best known to us and everybody on this call, I suppose, as ambassador of the United States to Australia during the Obama administration, where Jeff made many friends in Australia and did great service to the national interests of both countries, frankly, in being such an effective ambassador during his spell down here in Canberra, where he still has a lot of friends in Australia. But right now he's back in the United States, where he is now Chief Legal Officer at Cruise. But prior to that, in addition to being ambassador, he was special counsel to President Obama. He's been president of the State Bar in California. He's had big jobs at big international law firms. He's had special master roles in the US court systems and teaches now and then at Berkeley Law, but in particular back here, his academic connection in Australia, in addition to us here at the US Study Centre, is that he is lent his name and reputation and good insight and taste to the Jeff Bleich Centre for the US Alliance in Digital Technology, Security and Governance at Flinders University in Adelaide. Terrific, everybody. Thank you for joining us on a Friday afternoon in Australia, a Thursday night in the US. And literally, we have asked our staff to alert us. I'm just looking over here at a monitor, should one of those states fall. I'll just to dispense with this so we can get it out of the way. Where are we? Joe Biden is almost surely going to win this election. As I do, I think Nevada is a safe call. At this point, at that point, that would mean Trump would have to win Arizona, Georgia, and Pennsylvania. Losing any one of those 3 states at this point would see him fall short of 270. Every other combination of those states sees Biden at 270 or better. So indeed, Jeff and Chelsey, you may not be aware, but one of Australia's, you can bet on anything in Australia, and one of Australia's leading betting agencies, Sportsbet, already paid out on Biden. Mind you, they also paid out on the Labor government before the last federal election, a Labor government before the last federal election here in Australia. But anyway, as they say in Australia...
You hadn't told me that second part.
What's that?
I said, I wish you hadn't told me that second part.
It may be all over bar the shouting, and shouting there is, and we'll talk about that perhaps in a moment. Where these legal challenges might be going. Jeff, that is firmly your neck of the woods, and I'll come to you for a bit of insight on that. But first of all, I wanted to come to Chelsey. Look, with the results as read, massive voter turnout. Chelsey, I wanted, what is some big picture takeaways Australia should take from this election, shaping up as a likely win, narrow win for Biden? But, walk us through what else you're seeing in the election results and what they imply, first of all, for the US, but then secondarily for Australia.
Great. Thank you very much. Thanks, Simon, for having me. Thanks, everyone. It's great to be here. It's been quite the week. And as you say, this election isn't actually over yet. You're probably being more confident in calling it for Vice President Biden than we're seeing even some of the major networks we've had on some of the major newspapers who've held off on calling Arizona in particular, despite the fact that Fox called it on the night. I think one of the biggest takeaways from this for me is, we're on track for the biggest voter turnout in a century in the United States. Now that's a huge thing when we know that voter turnout is such a challenge in America. And it's also worth noting that Donald Trump won more votes last Tuesday than any Republican candidate for president has ever won. He's increased his vote from 2016, and the votes there must be more than the base that he was talking about. So the vote turnout for President Trump is significantly more than what polls were indicating. And I think what that says is, there is a strong support there for the message that he was saying. Now that's an interesting note, even if we are working on an assumption, Simon, that Biden is going to get up, because you've got a significant chunk of the American population who are either going to feel that that outcome is not legitimate or it doesn't represent anywhere the direction they were heading in. So the big challenge is going to be, if it is a Biden administration, how they bridge that gap and they bring this country together, because clearly there's a significant divide. We can probably delve in more detail as we go through this into the implications for Australia. Yeah. But, frankly, I don't see that there will be significant implications for Australia. We've already got such a deeply entrenched bilateral relationship. We're such a key partner for the United States. I think the only thing I would say is that a new Biden administration is going to be heavily distracted. There's going to be a huge domestic agenda right off the bat, and I'm sure that Jeff has some insights into that. But, a COVID relief bill, trying to do something to get COVID in some sense under control. I mean, we're seeing huge numbers here at the moment, and it's almost, not been discussed in the last couple of days that as we're going through this historic election and, seeing this count play out, that those numbers of cases and deaths are continuing. So I think just to set the scene, that those would be my key takeaways from this week.
Thanks, Chelsey. Jeff, sort of similarly, if we could just kick off with some high-level takeaways, and like I said, I think I put a lot on Chelsey there, but let's perhaps table the implications for Australia conversation. We can move to that towards the, as we go along.
Yeah, well, again, assuming it's a Biden presidency, and that's still very much an assumption. I think a couple things. One is, what we learned is that, there was not a blue wave, there was not a landslide. We were deeply, deeply divided, but very animated, which in some ways is very good for democracy, because it means that people are paying attention, they care, and they're looking for solutions to real problems. And I think one of the problems in our politics has been that it has been gamed through special interests, through both sides. We've all been talking about challenges in our political system for decades, but now you're seeing the public really rising up with two very different views about where we're going to go as a nation. And I think, by getting elected, Joe Biden has taken on a particularly hard challenge, because he's got to forge a path which is not what has disaffected people from the Democratic Party in the past, but not the path that Donald Trump adopted, which is very much not an American path. And I'm happy to talk about what I mean by that further. The biggest challenge for Joe Biden now is that he had expected that if he won, he would have the Senate and he would have a larger House, and that would allow him to do a lot of deep structural things like HR 1, which would change the way in which people are elected, do a major infrastructure bill that would put a lot of people to work right away, and a number of things that would not require the assistance of Republicans. Now he's going to have a very, very different challenge unless somehow they have a Hail Mary and they win the two Georgia Senate runoff seats, which seems unlikely. But apart from that, he's going to have to find a way to do something dramatic and innovative in a system where, the Senate will be trying to stop him at every turn. That's going to be a major challenge for him.
Thanks, Jeff. I'll come to you on the legal challenges at some point too, just to get our conversation about the state of the race. But first of all, Gordon, perhaps same question, lead-off question to you too. Your takeouts as a not just the leader of the Perth USAsia Centre, but a US citizen, skin in the game.
Well, Simon, it's an absolute delight to kind of partner with the United States Study Center again on this for the 5th month in a row. And boy, those 5 months went by quickly. It seems that they went by more quickly than the last 48 hours, which has been dragged on very slowly. I have to say I benefited tremendously from my mistakes in 2018. Like many observers in the midterm election, election night, the much anticipated blue wave had not materialized. Marquee races in Texas and Florida and Georgia went the other way. And so, things looked very different that evening than they did over the course of the week that followed. And that experience kind of steeled me for this election itself, with an expectation that votes on the day would be different, the process would take longer. One of my big picture observations is that it's striking that international observers have heaped praise upon the United States democracy in terms of how, in the midst of a pandemic, this very cacophonous, 50-state electoral process where everyone has their own thing and they had to figure out how they were going to do it, what the process was. The election itself went really smoothly, and even though the counting is not as fast as we'd like it to be, the process continues to go remarkably smoothly without interruption, without violence, and to the point where, again, international observers have praised the United States for the way it conducted the election. And yet, we saw just an hour ago, and on election night itself, the President of the United States, in turn, denigrating the United States. And that just tells you what a topsy-turvy world that we live in right now. I kind of share your long-term optimism, and part of that is because of my home state of Arizona. Where, despite being sworn in as an Australian citizen in February, due to the close relationship between our countries, I'm able to be a dual citizen and keep my foot in both camps. And as we've discussed in this program before, Flakes have had an important role to play in this election in Arizona. But I think Ambassador Bleich is right. It's not over yet. I have been struck with the tone in Vice President Biden, the Democratic candidate, who has been careful, has been measured. And I think in the long run, that will serve him and serve him the country well.
Thanks, Gordon. And I do want to come back to theories about Arizona. We can't not, with someone called Flake on the call, not get back to that. And indeed, with your cousin Jeff Bleich being our guest, what was it, a month ago?
Last month ago already, yeah.
Oh, what a month! My goodness. Anyway, okay. Chelsey, you spent a lot of your time as CG in LA, but thinking about public diplomacy, and that is, the the battle for hearts and minds, as it's sometimes described. Biden himself has talked about the distinction between the example of American power versus the power of America's example. And I'm just thinking through, both at an official level, how Australia, perhaps in government, but your sense of how Australians more broadly, the expat community that you're deeply enmeshed with there in LA, servicing all those years in LA, but perhaps more broadly, Chelsey, your takes on how this deeply divided US, the President of the United States, some of the things he's had to say about the process, how does that play around the world? And how does it play back in Australia, where we often talk about putting values, the shared values proposition as being so central to the strength of the Australian-US relationship?
Look, that's a good question. And I think, working again on the assumption of a Biden administration coming in, I think you're going to see a pivot back towards that soft power diplomacy. And there's a lot of ground to make up there. It's been a very different form of diplomacy under President Trump, very much led from the White House and from himself, where it has been unpredictable. And you've seen the United States retreat from a lot of those multilateral forums and, in fact, regional forums and the like. So I think that that's something that will be definitely something that will be of interest and relevance to Australia, is seeing the United States re-engage in those multilateral forums, and also, moving away just from a defence-centric form of diplomacy and investing back in that. And I think if you look at it at a nuts and bolts level of what it could mean for Australia, is a greater US investment into aid, into some parts of our region, particularly where there's been COVID impacts. So I think that in that sense, that will all be positive for Australia. In terms of the broader narrative, I mean, now that I'm outside of government, I can probably comment on some of these things at a deeper level, but I do pick up a sense in Australia that there have been very strong reactions to this election. There've been extremely high Australian engagement in the way the election's been conducted and the commentary. And I think it will be interesting down the track to have a look at Australian sentiments towards the US, and ensuring that it's recognised the significance of that trade and investment relationship to Australia, and doubling down on that. And I'm sure that the US State Department, Jeff, you probably have some insights into this, would have a strategy ready to go.
Thanks, Chelsey. And I'll just, before I sort of ask the inverse question of Jeff, recalling his time as ambassador, I'll just signal that, Chelsey, the US Study Centre is exactly sort of engaged in some of that research right now. We're halfway through a study. We went into the field with some survey research pre-election. We'll go back to the same Australians and the same Americans after the inauguration of whoever the next president is, to see if anything's changed on those matters. But early readout, Australians overwhelmingly wanted Biden to win this election. And that holds up in every segment of Australian society, except supporters of, frankly, it's sort of the one nation, other, Qatar. You've got to go out to that part of the electorate to find where Trump was sort of preferred to Biden. It's true among coalition voters as well. So that part of it is quite clear, for what it's worth. But Jeff, I wanted to ask you about the conduct of carrying the flag, as it were, under different sort of under different political circumstances back at home in the US. Does that make, implications for diplomatic headway in a country like Australia? Say, not that you were ever ambassador under W, of course, but does the popularity of an American president affect public opinion internationally, and then sort of have this sort of backdoor sort of enabling power for you representing American interests abroad?
No, it definitely does. There are presidents who are more popular internationally than others, and if you're a diplomat coming in with a popular president, it just greases your way quite a bit. I remember during the 2008 election, when U.S. popularity worldwide had fallen significantly, particularly with the global financial crisis and the Iraq War. Warren Buffett was asked how America recovers internationally. He says, well, there are two different ways. One is they're following 7 treaties that we would need to work on. We'd probably have to mend fences with the following countries. There would be an aid package, the whole complex set of moves. Or, you elect Barack Obama and you're good. and he was right. I mean, there was a warm welcome back to the United States at that point. I think it may be a little bit more challenging this time. simply because George W. Bush may have taken some policy choices that were unpopular, but in general, he believed very much in the New World Order and liberal world order. Was very strong on supporting alliances and sort of traditional ways of connecting nations, including free trade and fair trade agreements, and focusing on things like human rights and establishing U.S. values and rule of law more generally around the world. That has not been the approach of President Trump, and so there has been some structural damage that's been done, as Chelsey said. There's been among other things just the unsigning of agreements, whether it's the Paris Climate Accords or unsigning the Trans-Pacific Partnership without talking to the other partners of the TPP, or trying to get any concessions for us and them from China before doing so. Negative statements that were made about regional and international fora, not participating in them, and criticizing partners and embracing others, let alone issues like Ukraine and Kurds that we could get into in terms of a sense of abandoning our partners who are in military conflicts. All of that. On the other hand, Joe Biden is really well known around the world. He had he's been around for 47 years. He had 2 terms as vice president. He served on the Senate Foreign Policy committee, Foreign Affairs Committee. So he knows Xi Jinping very well, and he loves Australia and is well known to Australians and to allies and partners around the world. So I think he comes in already as a known quantity who can be trusted. I think one other point that I want to make, and without going on too long, is that because he's going to have a potentially hostile Senate, he's going to have to look for those areas of common ground. And one area of true common ground remains foreign policy, and particularly trying to improve our position and the position of our friends and allies in the Indo-Pacific, and to have a strong but smart relationship with China. And so he'll be able to drive that kind of a policy, and it may be an area where he focuses simply because other areas will be cut off for him.
Got it. Look, I do want to sort of, we're bouncing around a little bit. It's inevitable given the mix of expertise and backgrounds here. But Gordon, I heard you, frankly, you put it back firmly in my mind. We were on air together 2 days ago. And that quote from Joe Biden about the example of our power contrasted with the power of example was one you made, and we were on air together. So I'm interested in your thoughts about sort of the implications of A, the conduct of the election, but B, the aftermath if there is a change in the presidency for American soft power and American standing abroad.
Interestingly, the Australian media debate in the last several months, I think, has kind of missed it. They've tended to focus on who's better for Australia, and they've tended to focus on the bilateral. And that really misses what I think is a potentially seismic shift that's taking place if, as we assume, Joe Biden does win this election. And the reason is that the last 3 Australian governments, Abbott and Turnbull and now Morrison, all deserve incredible credit for the way they have managed the relationship with the United States in extremely difficult circumstances. I'm hard-pressed to identify any U.S. ally the globe over that has done as well. That has kind of avoided, if you will, the eye of sour and the negative attention, and managed to hold things together. So my hat's off to our very able diplomats as well as the governments for how they've managed that. But that misses the broader picture, and that's the environment in which our alliance exists. I've long believed that Australia has, in addition to its own very capable defense forces, 2 basic strategies for guaranteeing our national security in an uncertain world. And number one is an alliance partner with a powerful partner far away, originally the UK, for the last 75 plus years, the United States. And the second has been reliance upon the rules-based order. That post-World War II liberal international system of laws, institutions, standards, norms, and agreements. And that's what's really made Australia probably the globe's most full-throated advocate for multilateralism. Well, the last 4 years has seen a United States approach where America first has almost always meant America alone, where allies and alliances were denigrated, where multilateralism, was opposed, where again, and Jeff pointed out several very important examples where these agreements were pulled out from. So, that shift is the really important one. It isn't whether or not Australia and US are going to be on the same page on climate change, or those individual bilateral issues. The bilateral relationship is remarkably strong. The question is, what are we going to be doing together in the world to advance our shared national interests? And that's where I remain remarkably optimistic. And agree, I agree very much with Jeff that's one of these areas where Biden himself is going to be inclined towards, and Republicans in the Senate are going to be inclined to cooperate with him on that front.
Yeah, here, Jeff. It's an important point, and one that we at the US Study Center sort of amplify as well. I think you're right. There's so much institutional ballast, I think, as Kim Beazley likes to say, in the US Australia relationship, and indeed when we're in Canberra, as you are, Gordon, diplomats, public servants, the pollies aren't too worried about the bilateral per se. It's the nature of US engagement in the region and how the alliance, I think, is evolving to become a vehicle for advancing Australia's interest in a regionally engaged US and broadening the nature of that engagement away from things that are painted battleship grey and into those other domains. And point well said. Jeff, while I'm going to jump back to US domestic matters, taking advantage of your legal background, and I can imagine sort of many side conversations you're having with Democratic friends around the country. I've long thought that Democrats needed to finally stop bringing a knife to a gunfight legally after 2000. Seems like they're ready for something should that need be this time. But Jeff, your take on just the viability, the plausibility of legal challenges in any of these close states getting up and perhaps disrupting kind of some of the counts. Wisconsin and Michigan have Trump in front, and Michigan's already moved the certification. But just your sense of the legal landscape as it pertains to the election outcome, Jeff.
Yeah, well, we are, we're very good in the United States at producing lawyers and litigation. So it's not surprising that it's in every aspect of our of our society, and including the election for president. Unfortunately, in this case, I think you're going to see a lot of litigation. Unfortunately, I had hoped that we might be able to forestall it, and one of the hopes had been that if there had been a early decisive result, that would have prevented some narratives from being created that would suggest that somehow through litigation you could get the get around the issues of vote counting and everything else. Would just put those things to bed. Instead, on the evening of the election, President Trump came out and said he was going to the Supreme Court. He came out today and made a number of statements suggesting that there has been widespread voter fraud and suppression and other things by the Democrats, and that was the reason for his for any vote count that would suggest that he lost because he couldn't have lost. I don't see any theories yet that are particularly compelling, and if as I'm expecting, Joe Biden doesn't merely win in one state and get to 270, but actually takes Arizona, Nevada, Georgia, and Pennsylvania, then at that point it's very difficult to say that the Supreme Court is going to invalidate all of those different states' resolutions, ignore the fact that the largest number of people in American history voted for Joe Biden, and that he had been otherwise identified as having won the electors. So I think it's not a road that's likely to be successful, but it's one that this president will take. And we know we know Donald Trump very well at this point, and so when he says he's going to sue and he lawyers up, he's going to sue with lots of lawyers. On the other hand, Democrats were prepared for this, have been anticipating it, have a really strong legal team, and I think we'll see that play out over the next several days.
So you are anticipating courts slowing down certification in key states?
No, I'm not. I'm not anticipating courts slowing down certification. I'm anticipating a lot of lawsuits attempting to accomplish that, and I'm anticipating actions being brought by the president before the Supreme Court.
Chelsey, I wonder if you've got a view about the atmospherics around the transition, or moreover, with your ear to the ground, perhaps up through the Bondi Partners channel, if you're hearing anything about sort of the state of mind elsewhere, perhaps on the Republican side, does any other views on sort of the feasibility, plausibility of litigation, and if it fails, are we on a smooth pathway to a transition, or is there some card that Trump may play should he turn out to have lost the election?
Look, Simon, the one thing I can say confidently is he won't go quietly. I think we already saw the tenor of that this evening. We hadn't heard from the president direct to the media other than through Twitter for 2 days. And then he came out this afternoon in a press conference, which, was a sign of things to come, in my view, where he is basically saying he's won the election if it was done on eligible votes. And so he's laying down that gauntlet. He is going to continue, I think, to pursue this legal course, and I even think post inauguration he'll continue to be a very noisy force in conservative politics, and potentially even more so than he has been while he's been in the White House, where if there was any constraint on him, all of that will be gone. So I think Jeff's 100% spot on that we will see this litigation. I hope that it won't actually delay results. I think that, fundamentally this is a bit of a show, but it raises doubts in the minds of some parts of the electorate as to the legitimacy. And that goes back to the point we made right at the outset about the significance of the vote that Donald Trump attracted. That is a huge number of people. He's got a very deep base, but that goes broader than that. So I think that is a huge task for an incoming administration to try and navigate that.
Really great audience question that I'll start filtering those into the conversation that picks up on that point, Chelsey. And I'd really like to have all three of you rather, take a swing at it. This comes from Sonia, and Sonia asks, does 2020 demonstrate that 2016 was misunderstood, that Clinton's loss wasn't because, quote, people didn't like her, that Trump's win wasn't an aberration, but actually represented a previously unrecognized level of voter disaffection? Jeff, how about you take a crack at that? 70 million people have voted for Donald Trump.
Well, I think we knew there was a lot of voter disaffection in 2016, and I don't think you should underestimate the power of this election race, because it as Jeff Bleich said, because it dribbled in slowly, the votes. People thought of it as very much like 2016 for Hillary, except just a few votes the other way. It's not. When you're running against an incumbent. We've only turned out 3 incumbents in the last 100 or so years of United States history. It's a very rare thing to not give a sitting president a second term. And in this case, taking back a number of large and important states from him, if things go as we were discussing earlier, it would be Michigan, it would be Wisconsin, it would be Pennsylvania, Georgia, Arizona, and the second congressional district in Nebraska. Nebraska. These are major shifts. Particularly Arizona and Georgia haven't gone for Republican or for a Democrat in 30 years. So if you take all those pieces, what it says is it's a very different election. But the depth of feeling among Americans has only intensified over the last 4 years. I think part of it is that Donald Trump himself intensified divisions. That was part of his approach to governance, was not to reach out and try and unify. It was to say, you're either on my side or you're against America, and divided us even further than we were in 2016. So I think we're in a different space than we were. I think the work is even harder for the next president than it was 4 years ago. On the other hand, I think the fact that Americans are so fired up on both sides means they're gonna start demanding innovation that we haven't seen from our government in too long. And I'm actually optimistic that usually these periods of great pain and distress in American society, though difficult while you're going through them, have produced a much stronger, better, and strangely more unified America once you come through it.
Chelsey, do you have a take on that? I appreciate Jeff's optimism. I'm not sure I am as optimistic. I wish I could be, but I'm wondering if you've got a sense of it, or if Jeff's right, what would be a tangible sign of that coming together that Jeff's alluding to? Maybe that's a question for Jeff, but I'll put it on you, Chelsey.
Yes, I'll jump in there. I think one of the things to bear in mind in all of this is COVID. And I think that if a new Biden administration can come in and actually start to wrestle a little bit of control over that, including some national unity, which we have not seen, this is a very, very serious problem. We're heading into a third wave. This is impacting every part of the economy as well. I think that could be potentially a game changer. I think it will be a huge challenge. But on the broader question, initial question about, is this like 2016? I have to say, sitting there watching the results come in, at first I thought it was a bit like 2016 because the polls were so long. Yep. So I think the mentality of the electorate is different right now, but I think one thing this election has shown us is that the old system is gone. It is broken. Polling, at least the way it's done, is not getting to voter sentiment. I think the Republican Party will have a lot of thinking to do about, its future. And I think that where all of that goes will depend on just how much of a distraction or a disruptor Donald Trump can be in the next phase.
Gordon, did you want to get in on this?
Add on that, and if it's possible to be even a little bit more optimistic than Jeff on this front. So much of the narrative for the last 48 hours has been, how in the world did 70 million American voters look at the chaos of the last 4 years, the COVID-19, 240,000 deaths, and say, yeah, we want 4 more years of this. And actually, I tend to be to look at it a slightly different way. Again, as I mentioned at the outset, had Republican legislators in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania not deliberately forbade the counting of votes before the election, right? And we had the results that I think we ultimately will end up with, which is Arizona, Nevada, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan, announced on the night, and then maybe even Georgia. The narrative we're having right now would not be about division. We probably, once the votes are counted, Biden will probably win by close to 5 million votes.
Sure.
And so again, this is again, there have been 2 elections in the last 20 years that are closer than that. So it's not nearly as divided as people think. And more importantly, that was, again, to build on what Jeff was saying, despite the tremendous powers of incumbency used more aggressively by this president than any president in my memory. In other words, the narrative, the fact that the overwhelming majority of Trump voters believed that the COVID problem has been solved, believed that the economy is better today than it was at the end of Obama, when data shows that more jobs were created during the last 3 years of Obama than the first 3 years of Trump, and that was before the COVID collapse, right? There's just this fundamental disconnect, and that's a disconnect because the president used and abused the full power of of his ability to drive the narrative every single day, and then the powers of the state to prevent any other kind of alternative view going to his viewers. And so I believe firmly in the power of transparency, the power of daylight. And I anticipate that if Biden does indeed win this election, that one of the things that you're going to see quite dramatic is, one, a rapidly diminished megaphone in the hands of the president. You even saw an hour ago, Twitter had put out a statement that says, once he's no longer president, Donald Trump will be bound by the same rules of Twitter as the rest of the world. In other words, he tweets like that again, he'll get cut off, right? So there's a lot of interesting things going on that will happen. So I'm optimistic. I think there's reason to believe that we'll find a pathway to unity. And I can't think of any of the candidates that were in that very impressive field of Democrats that's better positioned to do that than Joe Biden. That's just his demeanor, that's his experience. May not have been as exciting to some on the far left, but that's what he did in Washington. So.
And Gordon, I would just jump in on that as well. I think another factor, because you picked me up now with all that optimism, but one thing we didn't mention before is that, a factor in this election, which we all need to bear in mind, is that huge early vote. Like the fact that has now, in a sense, slowed things down, but also allowed this sort of greater engagement. But that, we're looking at the division and we're looking at the time it's taking, but that is actually just a huge phenomenon that needs to be taken into account too. 100 million votes ahead of actual election day.
Yeah,
go ahead, Jeff.
When I was an optimist before, I just want to give a couple of historical reference points. McCarthyism, 1968, the 1920s when we had anarchists and we had, some of our most fraught and violent politics ever. And then, of course, the Civil War. These are all periods during which Americans just seem to have irreconcilable differences, and then we have come together. I think if we just take the long view, we understand that typically it's because something fundamental is happening in our society. Major economic dislocations, changes in media and the way we communicate with each other, movements, dramatic demographic shifts, all those things, whenever they happen, this is what we do to each other. And as long as we stay true to some basic American values, we come out of it, and we come out of it stronger.
Well,
so I'm not just
Jeff.
Pollyannish.
And the specificity is welcome, and indeed, reminding people that is to be an adult at the time of 1968, means you're 70 years old if you're 18 in 1968, and so but it's an important historical reference point that not so long ago the US was going through things far, far, far worse than what we saw in terms of disorder and violence in the streets. And the good news, I think, is we've seen nothing like that around the election thus far, at least, which is a great thing too. And Gordon, for the record, we're at Trump's lead, Biden's lead right now is 4 million votes, with California has only counted 75% of its vote. That's going to blow right out. That'll be a 6.5 million plurality, I think, by the time we're done. In one of the things about 2016, that slow counting of the vote in California it just kept pushing Hillary Clinton's popular vote margin out, and just sort of putting the Electoral College result into sort of ever more contrast. Yeah.
Worth noting that, presuming that Chelsey is still in California as well, that this is one of these rare panels where we've got 3 people on the West Coast, and only 1 on the East Coast. And so what we're really waiting for is these West Coast results out of Arizona, California.
Well. Okay, Gordon. Let's do that. Let's talk about Arizona, buddy. So big, and I do want to tap into sort of your deep knowledge of the desert Southwest and its politics. Real briefly, for an Australian audience, we're going a little deep here. But when you think Arizona, I think Senator Goldwater. I think the founding of sort of American conservatism as we know it, the desert Southwest, free-spirited, libertarian in its outlook, And then I also think more recently, John McCain. And then even more recently, I think about your cousin, Senator Jeff Flake, opposing Trump on a few things, Trump coming after him in his primary, kind of ending, frankly, Senator Flake's career in the US Senate. And now Arizona appears, and it's still highly provisional, but seems to be on track to be joining that procession of states in that part of the country. Over my time in the United States, 1990 to 2015, Colorado, New Mexico, Nevada, Obama won it twice. And now it looks like Arizona, post the first election after the death of John McCain, might be going that way. Your sense of what's going on there, is it demographics? Is it McCain/Flake specific? Is it the fact that it's a border state and there's a Latino population there? I mean, just give us a quick sense of that.
Well, Simon, from your 20 plus years at Stanford, you'll actually understand this better than most, but Arizona is a very interesting microcosm through which to view the overall election. And that is, there is a broad demographic change taking place in America. And part of what we're seeing in terms of this very stark divide in which Donald Trump, rather than soothe, has exploited, not only 4 years ago, but again this time, is anxiety around an older, whiter Protestant population who's uncomfortable with the changing demographics of America. And so what you see is in urban areas on the East Coast, but most recently on the West Coast, as California became majority minority, as you look at the other Western Coast states, you look at Nevada, you look at New Mexico, they're almost permanently shifting into the Democratic camp, given the changing demographics of those societies. Most people assumed that Arizona was still probably 2 cycles away from becoming like California or New Mexico, just on demographics alone. There's several things that have happened. Insanely expensive house prices in California, and Jeff will know that, have pushed a lot of Californians into Arizona, as well as a lot more Hispanics. You also have, I was born and raised a 1% white minority in the middle of America on a Native American reservation. And they're listed on most TV polls as something else, but in Arizona, they really matter. There are religious issues there. There's been a lot of media about my own faith, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Mormons, talking about the Mormon wall in Arizona, who women in particular have rejected. When you put that all together and you overlay that with the ghost of John McCain, it results in a turning of the election 2 cycles earlier than you would naturally expect it to be. I did see several interesting comments that President Trump had these very strange personal vendettas against John Lewis, and against John McCain, 2 people who were broadly revered on a bipartisan basis in the United States. And if you look at both Georgia and Arizona, it does seem that there's a bit of a karma taking place between these 2 states in the course of the election. Just a bit of detail. I actually, as much as I exulted in the early Fox News call, I think Fox probably called Arizona a little bit too early. There's about 260,000 votes left to be counted in Arizona. Of those, 200,000 are from Maricopa County. In the last batch that was dropped just about an hour ago, Trump is winning those by about 14 percentage points. If with the remaining votes he's going to overtake Biden, he's going to need to win by 18 percentage points, but it's really close. We're down to 46,000 votes of a margin. So ironically, I think Pennsylvania and Michigan are going to provide much larger margins for Biden than Arizona. I'm still pretty optimistic looking at the lay of the land, and I think those people who dig down into the county by county, whether it's Maricopa or Pima or Pinal County, are still optimistic that that lead will hold. But candidly, I think for democracy and for the country, all hats off to Fox News for making that call early. What it did is it changed the narrative, and it prevented the president from doing what he wanted to do, which is standing up the night of, and not just ramblingly so, but formally declaring victory based on those results. And it basically just had everybody slow down and take a breath. And in the end, I think that's going to be a useful thing.
Jeff, I'm just wondering if, again, your connection to democratic politics, and I should have done this at the top. I gave my read of the race from here in Sydney, but I guess, you know, your read of the race. I mean, this assessment that, you know, Arizona might flip, we might see a lead change there. What's your sense of how this is going to wind up?
No, I think I'm where Jeff Bleich is on it, which is it is going to be tighter than people anticipated. But I do think that if you just look at the numbers, particularly Pima County, which is a much more heavily Biden area, I think that will start to reverse this trend of, you know, big chunks coming off of the Biden lead. But regardless, you know, the point is, what's most important for, I think, Democrats to understand is, for the first time in a long time, they are highly competitive in Arizona. They are highly competitive in Texas. They are highly competitive in Georgia. And whatever the combination of states is that might put Joe Biden over the top, that competitive opportunity isn't going away. And it's something that Democrats really need to focus on, because demographics have shifted. And people who were promised a lot by Democrats up north have been frustrated, and people who've been promised a lot by Republicans down south are frustrated and are looking for alternatives.
Jeff and Chelsey, do Democrats have to be disappointed with the result? I mean, it's not you said at the top, Jeff, it's not the blue wave. Tons of money was thrown against Senate incumbents, Republican Senate incumbents. Susan Collins was gone for money and has walked it in. Lindsey Graham has shrugged off the most expensive, actually I think it turns out to be the second most expensive, because in North Carolina, I think turns out to be the most expensive Senate race in history. And there's been a net shift. Dems down one in Alabama, which they're always going to lose, but only 2 pickups. Arizona, or at least we think Arizona, and Colorado, right? And they're in that bucket of states. There's been some speculation, and it's based really on the exit poll, and polls are sort of a dirty word at the moment. But Trump did very well with minorities, at least historically, relative to past cycles. I've seen one piece of data that suggests 1 in 5 African American men voted for Obama. Obama did 80-20. Biden did 80-20 among African American men. The Miami-Dade story is you know, Biden has trailed Hillary Clinton there by about 10 to 15 points or something like that. It's double digits. Is there a rationalization, I mean, for that performance? And in particular, a story that we've told about the minority, the non-white share of the electorate being this deep, when turnout goes this high, you know, I would have thought on the back of record-breaking turnout, that's got to be a huge cycle for Dems, but it hasn't been.
So look, the number one lesson that will be taken from the Democratic Party from this election is they paid way too much for pollsters. They did not get their money's worth. And so I think there's an understanding that their belief that either antagonism towards Donald Trump or, you know, their ability to, you know, hammer on an issue where they were, you know, the party of science and could be trusted, and facts in a period of great unease and anxiety wasn't enough, and that they need to come up with a whole new set of policies and a whole new way of talking to people. What Donald Trump did very effectively was he convinced them that he was independent of both parties, and that they could rely that he was being himself, that he wasn't saying something that a pollster told him, that a consultant told him, or anything else. I think Democrats need to take a lesson from that. And that means not only come up with new policies, but a new way of communicating, which isn't poll driven, that isn't consultant driven, that doesn't sound like, you know, the back room scenes on Veep, where people are whispering in the ear of, you know, how are you going to talk to this demographic? And all the things you were just describing, which is, well, we're trying to get, this group or that group or that, just say what you actually believe, and connect with people at that level. I think that will be an important lesson that Democrats will hopefully take from this whole experience.
Chelsey?
I'd agree, Jeff. I think one of the differentiations between the campaigns was that Donald Trump had some real cut-through messaging, which you can see if you talk about Miami-Dade, like the messaging around, well, you can't vote for Joe Biden, he's a socialist. Like they hammered it home in particular segments of where they knew that would have cut through. I think you saw the same thing around oil and energy, where that was particularly targeted. And it's one of the things that Trump is masterful at. He gets one line and he just rams it home. And I think, above and beyond the message, it's about understanding those voters that you're talking to. And I think that, that is something that clearly Donald Trump did very well in this election. I think the other thing I'd take away, just looking at the election, as an observer, is this was a very, very different election. You basically did not have Joe Biden out on the hustings until right at the end. I mean, because of COVID, but you did have Donald Trump out there really physically rallying up his base, particularly those last sort of 12 days where he was doing 5, 6, 7 rallies a day. And I don't think you can take away from the impact and the momentum that had, ignoring the polls that Biden was so far ahead and just leaning in to his base and bringing that energy. That was interesting. And I don't think that the Democrats could have done it differently. I honestly don't, just because of the circumstances, but it is a point of difference in the way that the election campaigns were run.
Hey, we're running out of time. So I can't let the hour finish without getting to a foreign policy question. So we'll put a line under the US domestic stuff, kinda, because it's all related, for a second. But look, the single biggest bilateral in the world right now is US-China. Government-to-government conversations between Australia and the US sort of go China, China, China. And if they don't get there in the first 90 seconds, once they get there, they stay there. Differences in China policy under a second Trump administration versus a Biden administration. Very curious your read, all three of you actually, but we haven't got a ton of time. So these will probably have to be hot takes if you don't mind. Ambassador Bleich, we'll start with you.
Okay, two very different approaches. Donald Trump is a transactional person. It's all one-off bilateral relationship and what's in it for me. China actually liked him because they knew him. They're transactional too, and they don't care about human rights. He doesn't care about human rights. And they also thought he wasn't particularly adept at these sort of transactional negotiations, at least in the world of statecraft. Maybe he was good at real estate in New York, but he had not been a student of statecraft. And they felt they were running circles around him, distracted him, and able to do a number of things that are very dangerous for the United States' long-term national security and security of our allies. Things like the Belt and Road Initiative, which allowed them to lay infrastructure and accumulate debt among hostage countries, which they can use either threat or debt later to bring those countries into line. Similarly, things like 5G, establishing surveillance states and being able to, again, impose their will on their own people and people in the region. So that was not where Donald Trump was focused on. He was focused on, can I get a deal where I can show people that I was tough on China, and missed a bigger picture. I think you're going to see a very different kind of approach from a President Biden.
Thanks, Jeff. Chelsey?
Look, I don't doubt that we will definitely see a different approach, but my takeaway is that we won't see a significant change in the strategic posture in terms of particularly around tariffs. So, the campaign's tagline with China was confront where we must, cooperate where we can. So I think you're going to see a much more nuanced balance there, but I don't think you're going to see walking away from some of the efforts to confront China where the US feels they need to.
Fantastic. And Gordon, absolute last word from you.
Very brief. Too often in Canberra and elsewhere in the region, we tend to think about our policy towards China without paying enough attention to what's happened there. So a Biden policy towards China will be driven more by the changing nature of the Chinese state. There is one very important difference, however. And that is what I talked about earlier. I mean, the real strength of America has been its system of alliances, the strength of the international system. And so the Trump approach towards China has been all attitude and no strategy. I anticipate a Biden approach will be a little bit more nuanced. They'll want to cooperate on health. They'll want to cooperate on climate change, but they will leverage the tools that have traditionally been the real strength of the United States, its allies and the international system, and thus have a more effective policy. But ultimately, you know, there is a fundamentally different reality in China today than there was when Joe Biden was vice president.
That'll have to be the last word. We've gone past the top of the hour. Easy to do. There's so much going on, and so much of it with implications for Australia. I cannot tell you, or Jeff, you won't be surprised by this. The level of Australian interest in this election is just off the charts. All the major networks here went day long. The more live TV time spent on covering this election than you would on an Australian election. That's an absolute fact. It's just remarkable. Testament to the level of interest. And to all the people who are sending in questions, I wasn't acknowledging you particularly often, but rest assured, I was synthesizing all the questions in what I was putting to the panel as we went along. So thank you to so many people. Some of you are regulars. I recognize you from webinars that we've been running all year long. Thank you so much for continuing to stick with us. The election isn't over, so thank you so much for your continued interest and support of the US Study Center and of the Perth USAsia Center. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Chelsey. Thank you, Gordon.
Thank you, Simon. Much
Thank you,
appreciated.
Simon.
Thanks.
Thanks
Stay well, stay healthy over there in the United States, and we'll see you soon for another webinar shortly. Thanks, everybody. Bye.